Hey everybody, this is Chuck here for deucescrack.com, coming at you with our episode of Beginning Omaha 8. In this video, we are going to start off by talking a little bit about basic out of position flop strategy. We talked last week about playing some pots as a pre-flop raiser, so now I want to look a little bit more into how we would approach situations where we're defending, specifically from out of position in the blinds. Then we're going to start diving into some default flop examples. Rather than going into a live session, I kind of wanted to cherry pick and take some hands that can kind of reinforce some of the concepts we've built onto these first parts of the series, and use these hands to start talking adjustments 101. A big part of adjusting at the table is knowing how to take information, process it, and then use that information to change how you're approaching the game. So what we're going to talk about is through some of these examples, I'm going to take kind of one little nugget of information that I would take away from a hand, and from there, talk about how I would adjust in the future pre and post flop against that type of villain. So diving in, let's start with our flop play, specifically focusing today on out of position play. I just kind of want to hit the highlights here, so to speak, right? Everything we said about our pre-flop play, preparing us for the flop, and our logic carrying over from street to street is even more paramount here when we're out of position, but we're not going to focus on that side of it today. Now, since being out of position is such a reactionary game, right, and in a lot of ways, that's a big reason why we are at a disadvantage out of position. Our opponent either gets to react to our action or we have to react to our opponents, but they get the last laugh, so to speak. It's a good idea to have some population reads. How do I expect your average player to play in an 08 game? Now, these are obviously what we're going to be deviating from. The more we play, the more we start looking into these adjustments later on in today's episode. But for now, how do we expect your average player to play in a pot? First and foremost, and this is kind of a big one, and this stands true in just about any game, but specifically in 08, definitely expect a lower continuation bet frequency in a multi-way pot. So if you do flop well, we'll talk about that a little bit going forward, but initiative can be a lot of players undoing in a lot of two-card games. Just feeling like they raise pre-flop, they need to continuation bet in a lot of flops. Not something I see nearly as much in any four-card game, so definitely something to kind of keep yourself alert for. Second, a lot of players tend to have a lower turn continuation bet frequency. Usually that means they're only betting the turn with very good made hands. So often that means we can just go ahead and dump our actual hands to the turn. Doesn't mean that they're never going to have a bluff, or we're not going to have some sort of draw or hand that we want to see once more, especially because we're getting a good price. But in general, when a player bets twice, it usually means a good amount. And finally, I expect many of these players to be incredibly showdown bound. This doesn't change from in position to out of position, but it's something to keep in mind when you're playing pots out of position, because now as I continue to build the pot, I really shouldn't count on any fold equity. So, there obviously is going to be some, but I should plan on players showing down their big over pairs, their top pairs, a lot of two-pair combos, things like that, when I'm deciding whether or not I want to build a pot out of position. So if anything, it kind of could mean that we want to be only building pots with stronger hands. So let's just review a little bit of our thought process when we take a flop, specifically out of position. A couple of things in those bullet points there, just especially when we start talking about the lack of continuation betting in some multi-way scenarios. And really, one thing I've talked about throughout the entire series is just how sporadic some players in these kind of unevolved games, so to speak, can play. So it's important, I think, to have a very clear thought process for each of these situations. And when I'm taking a flop out of position, usually I'm thinking something along the lines of, well, how well did I flop? Again, this ties into that same evaluate my hand strength type approach. What does this hand really want? and really what is the best way to accomplish this. Now, what does this hand want? By that I mean, does this hand want to build a big pot? Does this hand want to just end the hand right now? Like, do I never want to see any turn or river cards? Which is a good way to think about some situations, notably some we're going to see later on in this video. And what's the best way to accomplish this, right? And those should be done with, this last bullet point should be done with respect for the previous population reads. So when we take that all into account, our general strategy is going to have us looking to build big pots by leading multi-way, right? If there's less continuation betting in a multi-way situation, when I flop well, this is a spot where I'm almost always looking to lead out into several players to try to build a big pot. Most players aren't going to be folding post-flop, so you can't bet 3-bet if you don't bet, is one thing I like to say. But at the same point, when you do flop well in a multi-way pot, when people are incredibly showdown bound / stubborn, flops checking through can be pretty disastrous, right? When we're putting in money out of position, we need to be recouping as much of that as we can in the long run to try to come as close to like break even out of the blinds as possible. And when we actually do flop well in those, 12 or 13 to 1 pre-flop scenarios, it's important that we build the pots. So I guess what I'm saying here is don't forget to pump the brakes and click the bet button rather than just auto checking to the pre-flop raiser as we are so often used to in a lot of games today. Second, I'd really advise check raising your strong made hands and draws. When I say strong draws, the thing to keep in mind again is often those are going to be your best hands with the most equity. I'm really saying check raise your high equity holdings, especially against players that are going to be tight to bet the turn in a game with blockers, right? In Texas Hold'em, we are not often worried about betting our weak flush on the turn because we're going to get check raised by the nut flush in a limit game. But that comes up in Omaha 8 or better. And if we don't build our pots with our strong made hands and draws on the flop, our really high equity holdings in good situations when we hit the flop, like we covered in previous videos. So those of you completely new, make sure to check out the earlier how to read a flop type stuff. We leave ourselves to kind of be shortchanged, so to speak. You don't want to be constantly finding yourself out of position, wondering, where's the rest of this pot? And finally, it's important to have a value bet plan. One thing as we get to turn and river play, we're going to find is you're often going to have a very good half of the pot. And sometimes we want to bet and call a raise with that half of the pot. Sometimes we want to check and call. We need to know where we stand on that. And keep in mind, when we're check raising our strong made hands and strong draws, it doesn't mean that we're always going to be hitting our scoop outs. We could hit our nut high outs on the turn, then the river pairs the board, so we no longer have the nuts. There's a lot of things that can go wrong. But it's important at each point in time to kind of have a plan for, do I want to be betting this hand for value, and how am I going to be reacting to my opponent? Essentially what I'm saying here is act with regard for the turn and river again. So let's jump into some examples. I think the best way to kind of A, reinforce a lot of these population reads, B, start talking about how to adjust the table, which I think is really what I do best in the games and kind of keeps me on the upper side in a lot of these matches or the games I find myself in, on the higher tier, I think, so to say, and also just to reinforce some pre-flop play so we can continue. For each of these, so we can continue to reinforce our pre-flop theory. So the process is going to be the following. First, we are going to discuss the flop action, right? How should the hero in this hand act on the flop with the holding, with regards for obviously the other players in the pot, what the flop is, and what the pre-flop action was, which are all details we will have. After we formulate a plan, we'll just take a look and share the results of maybe how certain players played a certain run out, or really maybe what this player thought was okay to play from a certain seat, etc., etc. And from there, we're going to talk the basics of how I would adjust after going back to look at those results. Those of you playing on American-facing networks right now get to play on Bovada, and we have a pretty rare opportunity to take a look at non-showdown hands. So when I do bet fold, I can request the hand history and see what my opponent was playing there. It's really a great opportunity to kind of broaden your own poker perspective, if I can use a phrase as cheesy as that one sounds right now. But just getting to take a look at what players had in spots will give you a good look into how that player thinks. And when so often, as I've said in the past, players are making fundamental mistakes, being able to recognize the fundamental mistakes they're making is such a huge advantage. Just being able to then adjust on the fly and say, oh, this player thinks that hand's a 3-bet, so first I should 4-bet stuff like this. Second, I'm going to play the following way in 3-bet pots. Or this player limps hands like that. Maybe I should be isolating more with more hands like this. And thoughts like that are, always going to turn into more BBs per 100 for us. So the first hand I have here, the hero is in the big blind. We see there are 2 limpers and the small blind raised pre-flop. I have the small blind listed as the PFR. Now, because there are 6 max seats, they're really just more to be they're just more meant to be a shorthanded situation. It could be a full ring game where maybe it's just late position players. One kind of unique thing to our pre-flop style is we don't really have much of an open limping range, if any. It's so narrow that I think really even reviewing too many pots against us there, because our open limping range is just that exploitable, isn't that relevant. So when we have limpers, we can just kind of almost approach it in a Boolean sense, right? Can limp or not limp. These players approach the hand like this. They see 4 cards and say, this is a limpable hand or not a limpable hand. Anyway, we are in the big blind with ace, king, 10, 5. Here, just a little bit of pre-flop review. We see that the small blind raise, we are in position against the pre-flop raiser. We have an ace and a wheel card and 2 Broadway cards, even though we're not that suited. Even though we're not suited at all, this is going to be way too much of a hand for us to fold pre-flop. We can really hit some good flops. I'm also expecting both the limpers behind me to call. So in a pre-flop raise situation, that means I'd be getting, on my call, immediately 5-1, and then more likely is going to be closer to 7-1 after the other 2 players call. Limpers are typically hand in hand with passive play as well. So to have passive players behind you, it doesn't make the threat of being out of position nearly that fierce, so to speak. So let's see what kind of flop we take. And we flop queen 8-4 with 2 clubs. And in this situation, the pre-flop raiser actually bets into us. Now, the first thing we should notice is we do actually have the ace of clubs. So in this hand, it's not all that relevant because we really haven't flopped much. But in certain situations, it's good to know that the pre-flop raiser can have a hand like ace 2 of clubs, which is always going to be 3-betting. So the blocker, even though I think floating this flop in an effort to maybe represent the nut flush is truly a fool's errand, especially in a board texture like this. And I will talk about the board texture in a moment. It's still relevant to know that because it does block some hands that opponent could be jamming, or it also blocks the fact that a player could be raising behind you, right? If I had ace 2 here, I'd feel a lot better about my hand knowing that, well, at least I don't have to worry about going bet call and then a limper raising the nut flush in the small blind, now 3-betting, and now I have naked nut low draw, and I have to start doing math. On this board texture, on this board texture as well, we see an 8 and a 4. When you see 8-4, you should usually just be thinking 5-6-7, which are the types of cards players should not be playing. But on occasion, some looser, badder players can try to open limp. It's a very welcoming board texture. A lot of hands can continue here. 9-10 jack, also lots of gut shots in there as well. While I do have the ace of clubs, I also only have an ace 5 low draw here. I think we have a pretty easy fold here when this player leads out, despite the fact that we only have, the fact that we do have a low draw, and I'm showing the results here because I wanted to talk about how I would adjust after seeing this player raise his hand pre-flop. But 2-3 is a better low draw than us right now. We don't know anything about these limpers behind us. So for all we know, they're open limping their decent ace twos. So when you're playing a bit of a guessing game, which calling on this flop really is, right? Because we don't know how we fare too well. We kind of feel like we have too much of a hand to fold, but don't really love calling because the board texture is very coordinated. With two players left to act behind us, that's more uncertainty behind you. So I feel like when you're squeezed in the middle of those two things, it's a good time to just reconsider and just muck your hand. Now, we're in the big blind this hand, so this very well could have been our first hand at the table. Once I see the small blind raised with queen, queen, 4-5 single suited, I'm feeling a lot worse about my fold on the flop, just because, well, now that I know this player can be doing this with lots of garbage hands, I would consider queen, queen, 4-5 a pretty mediocre hand. And certainly, if I'm raising out of the small blind, I want a really, really strong hand. So this would not be one of them, right? Any ace high or queen high board, almost any. There's obviously going to be some, king high board, almost any. There's obviously going to be some that this player could flop well on, notably ones where they have a flush draw or some sort of wheel gut shot. But most of them are going to be very difficult. So building a pot out of position really isn't all too spectacular. And even here, when they flop top set, we see this is actually like one of the worst boards up there, bad board for their hand when they actually flop a set of queens, because A, they only have a live 5 for the low, and B, we already talked about the high quantity of straight draws and flush draws on the board, as well as the fact that they block some of their some of their full house outs. So against a player like this, I would be happy to raise flops a little bit more aggressively to potentially get them heads up, because in general, in these bloated pots, A, there's more dead money in there, and B, this player is going to have a lot of hands that are weaker than what they're representing. Their range is going to be too wide in a lot of situations. That being said, I'm not looking to raise here again with all the players left to act behind me, but I am in position against this player, so I'm looking to adjust more when they're opening under the gun, or notably when they're opening the cutoff, and I could be 3-betting them from the button. So despite the fact that they could have a pretty wide range, it still doesn't change the fact that I have two players left to act behind me. There's a flush draw on the board, and I only have an ace-5 for the low. Okay, so the next hand here, things get a little bit complicated for us pre-flop. The hero opens in the cutoff with king jack 2-5 double suited. The button cold calls, and the small blind 3-bets us. So the hero gets to call pre-flop. In terms of pre-flop situations, when I am getting 3-bet here, I'm going to give this player a good bit of credit. My mind immediately goes, if this is my first orbit and I have no reads, my mind immediately goes to aces or some good ace-2. Once the cold call comes into play, the squeeze here becomes a lot more for value as opposed to just pushing out the big blind to get the pot heads up. So I'm giving this player a good amount of credit right away. And we flop pretty okay. We flop a king high flush draw with a 25 low draw. The pre-flop 3-better bets, and the action is now on the hero. So a couple of things about this board texture. Number one, we do have a good low. We do not, as we did in the previous hand, block or have any kind of nut flush draw, though. This 3-better in the small blind could in fact have ace 2, 3, 4 double suited and all those ultra premium holdings. If you think about it too, if we do raise, we can end up forcing out the button with a lot of their weaker hands that maybe want to peel here. There's some upside to that on occasion if I could be raising here maybe to get them off of, let's say I had, 4-5, king jack 4-5. Maybe I get them off of 3-4 or their 2-5 low draw. They're only going to call with a 2-3 low. But that's a lot of work to bloat a pot against a seemingly strong range from a small blind 3-bet. So there's some strong downside there to raising. And in general, like this board texture isn't one I'm going to be too thrilled or, going to be raising all too much in this situation. So I do like just calling here and seeing a turn card. Now, results-wise, let's take a look at the kind of hands our opponent showed up with. And it was a bit of a role reversal, right? The small blind 3-bet us here with the ace, king, jack, jack, Badug, and the button cold called with ace 2, 3, 4 double suited. So I would put these two player profiles as ones that you would see relatively often. In other words, like if I'm at a full ring game, I'm expecting one player to maybe fit into either of these buckets. First, let's talk about the villain's decision to 3-bet ace, king, jack, jack, rainbow in the small blind, right? Again, as I mentioned, in games like this, when players are making fundamental mistakes, this is the kind of thing I'm looking for. This is not a hand that really wants to bloat a big pot, but everything about Texas Hold'em or even just Omaha High or just poker theory in general says, well, I have 4 big cards. This means I must have a pretty good hand, right? We know this player is acting with little to no regard for future streets because that's one of the main incentives to not wanting to build a big pot here. I wouldn't be shocked to see a player like this maybe jamming 2-pair on a flush draw board. Situations, again, where you're not really concerning yourself with cards to come. You're only kind of thinking about what you have now. I would happily, I'm happy to get 3-bet by this villain, and I think this is a situation now where you do want to be fast playing and be a lot more aggressive with your low draws and combo draws. If this was a heads-up situation, I think this flop would be a must raise against a player like this who could have hands like, ace, queen, queen, 10 in their range that are going to really feel sick to their stomachs on a card like a 7 or an 8 on the turn. That's going to give us some 2 pairs and straights and things like that in their eyes, right? As much as we could only, as a student of poker, you think, well, someone raising this flop is really representing flush draws and strong made low draws, right? But your hand reading is reasonable, where others can look at a board texture and see it change and say, oh, a 5, they must have a straight now, or a 7 or an 8, then we have 2 pair and things like that. Being able to represent some of those hands down the line can be beneficial. Now let's talk about getting cold called by ace 2, 3, 4 double suited, okay? This could go one of 2 ways here, right? Cold calling preflop with a hand like this could actually be pretty beneficial, right? Maybe I want to slow play a little bit pre-flop to bring in the blinds. Maybe the villain in the big blinds kind of loose and bad, but is not that awful. And the villain in the small blinds pretty splashy, but knows that I'm very, very tight. So, hey, I'm just going to go ahead and cold call here, and other players play a pot. I would probably need a little bit of post-flop information before I was, truly going to decide whether or not I thought this player was just so tight that they only wanted to flat the ace 2, 3, 4 double suited, or if they were calling to jam the pot post flop. And there's an easy way to decide that. I mean, to decipher that, and that is, when we call the flop, did the villain raise, or did the villain call looking to raise a later street? How trappy is this player? It's a really common trait you find amongst 08 players. I also would say I wouldn't be shocked to see a player actually 3-bet a hand like ace, king, jack, jack, and cold call ace 2, 3, 4 suited in the small blind. As irrational as it is, you technically do want to re-raise preflop to, promote the high hand side of your holding and potentially get the pot heads up. But I had played the World Series Limit Championship event one year. And at the time, a tourney pro who was no limit guy, hadn't had much limit experience, 3-bet pocket 2s after there was a raise and 2 callers trying to get it heads up. And, anyone who's played limit enough knows that when the math kicks in, at a certain point, no one really can fold. Okay, so here we have a limper and a pre-flop raiser in the pot, and the hero's in the small blind with ace 8, 8, 4, and we take a no flop because we would fold this hand pre-flop. I wanted to throw a trick in the mix there, but this hand here, if this is my second hand at the table and I see that someone limped under the gun plus 1, first and foremost, it's non-zero chance that our hand is worse than theirs. Second, someone else raises, and we can't really flop all too well. In an online atmosphere, I think just folding here is probably fine with your Badugi ace 4 off and pocket 8s in the small blind. I'm not necessarily giving too many players credit for raising all too wide there in the cutoff seat, right? We've seen plenty of examples, and you'll see plenty of hands where limpers just generate more limps. In your pot limit and no limit games, open limping is so easy to punish by making a bigger raise. As here, raising is usually just done to build a pot, and I'm not too excited about playing a hand like this out of position. In terms of results, if I was to see that this first player on the left open limped Jack, 9-3 single suited, that would be an instantaneous note for me, right? You definitely want to know that a player is going to be playing hands that bad for a limp, just trying to take flops. I use the phrase recreational player to describe just people that are not very good at poker that are in the games. And I think when I see hands like this, there's really no better way to exemplify the idea of a recreational player, like literally just trying to flop a strong, good hand and win a big pot with pocket jack. So I'm going to go ahead and open limp and try to flop a jack, see if I do okay. So I would definitely keep my eyes peeled for the fact that this player is limping this hand. And, this player could potentially still be raising a ton of junk, a ton of okay premium stuff, but right away, just assuming north of 75 VPIP right out the gate. In other words, playing over 75% of hands, ready to adjust instantly by expecting almost all of my raises in position when this player is in position to call, expecting them to fold the big blind almost never and call the small blind a ton. So at any point in time, I'll be aware that this player's at the table because likely their chips will make you aware that they're at the table because they'll be in the pot. Onto the preflop raiser with the ace-9-3-3 rainbow. This I think stands out because I'm not even sure I would want to isolate a limper with a hand this week. You're going to build a big pot pretty often, right? I'm not expecting your average player to fold ace-8-8-4 in the small blind here. And your hand is actually pretty weak. I'm not saying you have to necessarily fold it, but that probably could be best. The 9 is a pretty bad card, and there's a limper in front of us. If I knew the player was open limping Jack 9-3, I would go ahead and isolate them, however. Number one, when you are aware of someone's limping range, it's important to remember what is in the range at all points in times. And once you know that, you have an extra piece of information for post-flop play, right? We can act accordingly. This player, I would probably assume, could be a little bit more on the tag side, or at least on the aggressive side, and would probably keep my eyes peeled for some more loose isolations. And one notable thing here is if this is a 6-max game, this player is actually the button to our big blind. So we should expect them to have a wide open raising range on the button. We should be prepared for a lot of post-flop aggression and probably plan accordingly by not defending too loosely, check raising, having a pretty good aggressive dynamic with this player. Now we've got the 9-2-3-4 double suited in the big blind. The cutoff open raised, the middle position player open raised, the button cold called, the small blind cold called, and the hero took a flop. We've got 3 wheel cards, double suited. Happy to take a flop, getting a very good price. Here we're actually getting the 7-1 already, so no way are we checking through. And we hit a flop of ace-9-5, which gives us the 9-high flush draw, a pair of 9s, and then a wheel draw, just the nut low draw. The small blind checks, and it is now on to us. As we mentioned earlier in the episode, this is a situation where I would pretty happily lead, especially if it's very early for me in the game. If this is my first hand from the big blind, I don't think you have much of an incentive not to just go ahead and bet. The players don't really have any information on you. I'm not expecting any preflop raiser to fold a top pair of aces to 1-bet, but I do expect them to check it a decent amount of the time. We have only one player left to act in position behind that villain. And honestly, if the button bets and we want to build a pot by check raising, there's a chance that maybe, yes, the preflop raiser can get away from some sort of ace-2, king-queen type combo, as opposed to maybe they would peel that hand before. And on top of it, I don't expect the player on the button to bet really all that much. I think the hands they do bet are probably some of their stronger ones that A, maybe potentially raise, B, always call once, and C, at a very high frequency, will call twice. So often I'd rather just go ahead and lead here to build a big pot rather than go for a check raise or anything like that. So the question then becomes, how much does this dynamic change when the preflop raiser isolated a limper, as opposed to if a limper a cold caller on the button called a middle position player's raise? And I do feel like in this situation, like previously when the preflop raiser is in middle position, I think check raising is a little bit on the table, just because, you'll often see aggressive players or just the type of player that continuation bets, C bet a lot. I'm betting a lot of my ace, two, king, queens on this board texture. I've got one, when I'm in the previous situation, I got one caller behind me. I'll figure things out on the turn and river, and players play a ton of junky hands. So in that situation, it seems like, if I do check raise, I could potentially trap two other players in. But here, if I check raise, I would be facing the limper with two cold, potentially getting them off some of their like 3-4, 3-6, 6-7, 6-8 type hands. Technically, you can just take any of those two pairs of, any of those combos of cards and make them a hand. Like I'm not folding 3, 4, 6, 7, but 3, 6, 6, 7. Maybe, and I think a check raise could potentially force them out of that hand. So this is a situation where I think I'm pretty much like 100% betting, because also the preflop raiser can just check now and guarantee themselves a free card, which is much more appealing than potentially pushing out a player behind you. So even though two players flipped, and really my plan is pretty much the same, this is a situation where I think I'm not adjusting by check raising until much later in the game, as opposed to, if I knew that maybe the ace 9 3-3 player had open raised here in the previous example, right, from mid position, then maybe I'm looking for a check raise because that guy's pretty aggressive. But in this situation, I wouldn't. I'd want to just trap that player and hope to 3-bet them. Okay, so here we've got two limps from early position. We've got ace, queen, 5-2 double suited and raised for value. A player calls in the big blind, and we flop three pairs. And it is check to us. So pretty interesting situation. We have kind of a pretty good hand. I alluded at this situation earlier. What does your hand really want? Well, this hand really just wants everyone to flip up their hands and for us to say, I think we have the best hand right now, right? Can I take the pot? That's literally all we ever want out of this hand. Besides, obviously, a queen or a 5 on the turn would be nice. But if that's really all your hand wants, then we just want to keep the pot small. So if I could bet, I would bet 0, which means check. All right, I would just go ahead and check this hand in position and take a free turn card. We can't win every single pot. If we did raise, when we raise here pre-flop, there's 8.5 big blinds in the pot right now. Once we bet, who knows? You're gonna be getting 13 or 14 to 1 if someone check raises. The pot can get very, very big. You're gonna want to peel one off, and there's really not that much of an incentive to peel and see one extra card. All of those population reads, the passive play, and all of those things make opponents' bets much more transparent. It means players are playing a lot more face up. So it doesn't mean, if the turn is an 8 of hearts, it's going to be bet 100% of the time. You can get another couple of free cards. There's just really no reason, again, when we're thinking, what does our hand want? We just don't want this pot to get any bigger. We can take a free card here. And in a lot of ways, this supports maybe the big blind's decision, if they had flopped a good hand, to go ahead and lead out, which is what we would do here as well. But if we look at the results here, we see that the big blind actually called our raise pre-flop with queen 9, 7, 4 rainbow. This is a terrible hand. Point number 1, I'm really not expecting this player to fold much, if anything, in the big blind. 2, going forward, if I do see this player folding a decent frequency going forward in the big blind, what maybe would make this player call something this bad at this point in time? I think misclick is a reasonable answer, but we have two of them on the right of the screen, and it's limper 1 and limper 2, right? So maybe this player overestimates their ability to call pre-flop wide in a multi-way situation. And I would certainly look to punish this player by continuation betting against them a lot. I expect this player to be a little bit more stubborn, kind of maybe a little bit mentally gratuitous with the math, right? This is the type of player, if they did somehow get to the river with weak two pair or, a fifth or sixth nut low, I'm never really expecting them to fold it. Okay, so here now we are the hero under the gun and open ace-jack 10-2 with a nut suit. The cutoff cold calls, and so does the small blind. And we take a flop three-handed of 7-9-2 rainbow. So you paired your deuce. This is a very common Omaha 8 or better situation. When should we be continuation betting here? When shouldn't we? Well, first off, we've got two players in the pot, which if both these players were in position against me, I would probably just go ahead and check here. This is not a great flop for us, and I want a free card. But we do have position on one player. We got cold called in the cutoff and a small blind call. I'm expecting the small blind call to... Well, I'm expecting both these ranges to be relatively wide. And because both these ranges are relatively wide and I am in position against one player and only out of position against one, I feel pretty comfortable about actually continuation betting here. A couple other things that make me comfortable with continuation betting, though, of course, we've got a backdoor nut flush draw to go along with our hand. So there are some turn cards that are good for us there. We do have some scoop potential, right? A 2 is a great turn card. A queen or a king are good cards for us. Those are the cards we really want to see. An 8 is a pretty good card too. I mean, it's a good card, obviously. Jack's not bad. Ace is not that good of a card for us. We're not that excited about it. Most notably, like being out of position with top and bottom pair on a board texture where a player could be raising with some sort of like low plus nut low combo type hand. Nut low plus straight draw combo type hand can be very difficult. But that's really the only turn card that's like really gross for us and tough for us to play, right? Even if we get raised on like a jack, we'll figure it out. Or we get raised on like the 10 of spades, it's not very difficult. Like we can call. So there's a lot that our hand can do on future streets, which is why I'm betting here. If we had ace, queen, king, 2, and there was a flush draw on board, and we did not have it, I would just go ahead and check, right? Here, there are some just slam dunk turn cards for us, and more importantly, there's a lot of ways for us to pick up equity. And for all those reasons, I am comfortable betting here. It's all those little things that get put together that make it a bet. Now, results-wise, let's say we saw that the player in the small blind just called with ace-8, 3-6 the whole way down. And more importantly, let's say the board actually ran out turn queen of hearts, river 8. So this player then picked up a flush draw on the turn, open-ended straight draw. This player would and then, river then the nut low and just called as we bet all three streets with the nut high. This player would immediately get a pretty big passive tag. Value betting them in position, you certainly want to be a lot more snug. Facing any aggression against them, right? Now, let's keep in mind, we didn't get check raised on 9-7-2 with ace-8, 6-3. The question really becomes then, what actually check raises this flop, right? And that can actually help you get away from some pretty decent made hands if the players are really, if you're not check raising nut low draw plus straight draw, maybe they're only check raising sets plus nut low draw, or just made sets and things like that. Aggression from a player like this is going to mean you are likely getting quartered if you just have the nut low, in other words. And this is something I'm always looking out for because, in any limit game, when you're getting such a good price, so often you need a ton of confidence to be able to lay down your hand. So seeing little details like this where really like we bet this flop, get called twice, bet the turn, get called twice, get there on the river, bet, get called twice, chop, boom, next hand, move on. And if you just move on and don't take a note that this player was actually that passive here, only called pre-flop with his hand and all these things, you miss a lot of information that can help you make a fold later on and save a bet. Like when win rates are south of 5 VBs, as they should be, not as they should be, but as they are, making up 1 or 2 every 100 hands or so, or even every 200 hands is going to make a huge, huge difference. Hopefully these flop examples were a helpful way to get you guys started and gals started in working on your own flop game in Omaha 8 or better. Any questions you have about flop play in general, please feel free to post them here in the video thread on the forums, or just shoot me a message here on DC. Until then, this is Chuck for DeucesCrack.com, and we'll see you on the forum.